So I just want to thank the Denver Communists for inviting me to talk, members of my study group for generously deciding to shelve our discussion of Das Kapital for another week so we can talk about this. And I just want to emphasize that if I say anything outlandish, all views are my own. So you don't get mad at the Denver Communists. You can just get mad at me for saying something. And I think I'll start by acknowledging one of Jason made a flyer, two flyers actually, for the event. I'm going to start there with one of them, which has a picture of Jamal Bowman, who is one of the DSA congressmen. I believe he's in New York. And he's been in the news actually the last few months because he voted for the Iron Dome, which was funding for the military of apartheid Israel. And both inside and outside of DSA, there was a lot of basically there was an effort to have DSA either remove or expel Bowman. And the leadership of DSA has defended, has refused to expel him, and has said, it's we can influence him. We have a member of Congress. We have his ear, and it's a lot of these opportunist excuses, which a lot of people who are opposed to Bowman have brought up. It's like, our organization supposedly is opposed to BS and all this, and here you are offering all these excuses. And this is going to bring it back to Harrington, is the fact that this is not new. This actually goes all the way back to Michael Harrington himself, the founder of DSA. This type of opportunism, this type of support for Zionism and imperialism and the Democratic Party. And Harrington himself, first of all, who is he? Well, he's in the latter half of the 20th century, he's probably the most prominent democratic socialist in the United States. He's the author, most famously, of a book called The Other America about poverty in the US, which is very influential in the Great Society programs. But he's also a public intellectual who wrote a dozen books on everything from contemporary politics to socialism to the third world to narcissistically two autobiographies and whatnot. He was a self-described democratic Marxist, and he's also a political activist who was founder of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which is the precursor for DSA, the Democratic Socialist of America, which is currently the largest self-described socialist organization in the United States. And why Harrington is important is because he comes up with this whole strategy that we could just give a name as realignment. And it's basically this whole opportunist reformist strategy. And his idea is to take the Democratic Party, transform it, and into a labor party like in Europe, and use that to slowly build a welfare state and lead to socialism. And he comes up with basically this whole theoretical apparatus. He really refines this strategy, which he doesn't invent, and he puts it into practice. And it casts a long shadow, not only over Harrington and DSA, but over the wider American left, broadly speaking. A friend of mine who's actually on this in this event listed Harrington as one of the three worst leftists in American history, and the others being Shachtman and Browder, and I'd agree with that. Just because, this has influenced and damaged organizations for decades, this type of lesser evilism. So Harrington himself was an Irish Catholic born in Missouri in 1928. To a rather affluent family. He didn't really experience the Great Depression. And out of his family's heritage, he really only inherited their strong support of the Democratic Party. And Harrington himself, though, for the first 20 or so years of his life, was a devout Catholic. He had a Jesuit education, private schools. And when he graduated high school in 1944, he just missed the cutoff to join World War II in the American Army. He ended up going to Holy Cross here in Massachusetts, near where I live. And his parents wanted him to become a lawyer or some kind of career in that sense, but he was more interested in poetry and literature, and kind of fought back with his parents. He ended up going to the University of Chicago for a little bit. He went to Yale, and he really liked a lot of those bohemian areas. So he was actually in his circles, he was reading a lot of like existentialist literature. He was encountering socialists, members of the Communist Party, dissident leftists, etc. And some of this reading actually causes him to have a crisis of faith. And at one point, Harrington is really unsure what he wants to do with his life, and he's actually at home with his parents, and he sees like a dilapidated slum, and it's so profound to him that he wants to fight poverty, and he actually ends up, to bring the story ahead a bit, in New York, where he joins the Catholic Worker that's founded by Dorothea Day, which is basically as far left at that time as you probably could go in the Catholic Church. They essentially do like a vow of poverty, the minister of the poor. It's actually not something he likes particularly. He doesn't like living in those conditions. And he's in one of the few principled acts of his life. He was opposed to the Korean War, which broke out in 1950, and he refused to serve and was honorably discharged. It was kind of more luck than anything that he didn't end up in jail. And as he's kind of feeling the limitations of the Catholic Worker, he starts reading Marx and some other socialist writers. And he ends up joining the Socialist Party. This is the party of Eugene Debs. And he actually leaves it fairly quickly because the Socialist Party is supporting the Korean War. Their leader, Norman Thomas, is essentially like on the pay of the CIA and whatnot. So he actually leaves and he joins another group, which is called the International Socialist League, which was led by Max Shachtman. And I just have to backtrack here to tell you about Max Shachtman a bit, who's actually far more interesting than Harrington himself. Shachtman was one of the founders of the Communist Party of America, one of the founders of the American Trotskyist movement. He presided over the founding convention of the Fourth International in 1938. And he actually splits with Trotsky and the Socialist Workers' Party in 1939-40 over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the class nature of the Soviet Union. And what Harrington inherits from Shachtman are a number of things, because I'm not going to give you the full story of Shachtman, but by the time Harrington joined, which is in the early 50s, Shachtman is moving very far away from any identification with Leninism, Trotskyism, or revolutionary socialism. What he inherits from Shachtman is a deep seated. The Soviet Union is a bureaucratic, collectivist, evil empire. He inherits an idea, an orientation toward the labor bureaucracy, which Shachtman had been doing since the mid-40s. And also, Shachtman had started this idea of realignment, of starting to work within the Democratic Party to transform it. And Harrington will inherit these ideas and he will refine them, and he will break with Shachtman on more secondary issues. It's never anything fundamental or worldview-wise that he breaks with Shachtman. And the ISL, which is Shachtman's group, is very small. Since this is the McCarthy era, any group that's, avowedly socialist is pretty much viewed with suspicion. But Harrington himself is recognized as like a very energetic, very capable writer, organizer, and whatnot. He gets involved, with their paper, early involvement with the civil rights movement, which is starting to pick up. But there's a sea change towards the later half of the 50s after Khrushchev's secret speech and the Hungarian Revolution, which essentially destroy the Communist Party as an organized force, which had survived McCarthyism with still with tens of thousands of members, but essentially like the majority of them leave the party, which creates a huge opening for a new left force. And Shachtman wants to take advantage of that. At the same time, the Socialist Party under Norman Thomas, which at this point is essentially a dying party. So I think it's only on like the ballot in 5 states in 1956 for the presidential election. They kind of want to take advantage of that, and they want new people in the party. So Shachtman, Norman Thomas, to make a long story short, they end up fusing. And because the Socialist Party is so moribund, both Shachtman and Harrington end up in the party leadership, and they are essentially starting to shift it the way they want. And in the early 60s, McCarthyism is starting to fade away. There's like activism with civil rights is picking up, and there'll be student activism as well. And I want to mention Harrington, along with another prominent Socialist Party member named Bayard Rustin. They're involved in, I believe it's CORE. It's either CORE or SNCC. I can't remember off the top of my head. They're involved in organizing that and they made sure to keep out any sort of Reds. They are anti-communist red baiters. And also, they start getting involved in local Democratic Party politics, not presidential or anything like that yet at this time. The other thing Harrington does, and I know this is actually in the reading, I think this is the group that got the chapter, is he's involved in the founding of SDS, which is the Students for Democratic Society, which is one of the most important organizations in the 1960s. Basically, SDS was a relaunch of a group called, which was the student wing of a group called the League of Industrial Democracy, which is this old social democratic group that had been formed like in 1904 or 5 by Upton Sinclair. And it was pretty much dying at that point. They refurbish it and they rename the youth wing as Students for Democratic Society. And Harrington is one of the few younger socialists, some of these younger activists like, because he's only about in his early 30s at this point. And the people I'm talking about who are founders of SDS are people like Tom Hayden. And Harrington is influential with helping them to write something called the Pure Huron Statement, which is basically their foundation. And it basically takes a lot of Harrington's ideas. So there's like an orientation toward the labor movement, towards civil rights, towards realigning the Democratic Party. It's not in any way a Marxist statement, socialist, communist. At best, you could just say it's kind of left-wing social democratic or some kind of like radical liberalism, if you want. But there's one thing it does do that it rejects the Soviet Union, and it also rejects the United States, actually putting more of the blame for the Cold War on the United States than the Soviet Union. And Harrington, there was some kind of misunderstanding. He thought the Pure Huron Statement was more extreme in his views than it actually was. And he basically was also very upset when he found out at the founding meeting of SDS, not only that the Pure Huron Statement was not what he expected, but that there was a member of the Young Communist League there who was just like an 18-year-old kid. To him, it was like being in the same room with Stalin. And so he basically, him and the founders of the League of Industrial Democracy, they take the leaders of SDS and they basically put them on trial, accuse them of, working with totalitarians, of rejecting like anti-communism and everything. And basically, Tom Hayden, who's someone I generally don't feel much sympathy for, I kind of do, because he's like, I love Michael Harrington. He's like a father to me. And basically, it's like he's now a Stalinist the way he's treating us. And eventually kind of tempers cool, and they're able to kind of patch things up. And Harrington apologizes and everything. But this is kind of an important thing you'll see in Harrington's life is it's true SDS is not soft on, it's not this kind of radical organization at this time, but it's clearly starting to move away from this kind of anti-communist consensus. And it's definitely wants to get more involved in social movements. That's something Harrington does not want. He wants to put the brakes on that to keep things respectable. And I want to just talk a bit more about realignment and what that is and why that's basically doesn't work. So basically, Harrington is looking at the United States and it's like, this is an advanced capitalist country. Why doesn't it have a labor party like Britain or France or Germany? And he's like, well, there was a labor party, and it's basically the AFL and the CIO. So he thinks there was this labor party that was formed with the trade union movement. Thanks. Well, we can train, but they're under the Democratic wing, along with, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, all these kind of progressive constituencies. And he's saying, well, if we can just take all the racists and the capitalists from the Democrats and transfer them to Republicans, we can get the Democrats to be a social democratic party. Now, the thing is, and he actually is very explicit at one of his articles. He said, realignment is the only place where a beginning can happen. So basically, his whole strategy for change fits on this. But the thing is, in order to be in the Democratic Party, he's kind of thinking that these are all kind of equal groups: labor, civil rights, the capitalists. When that's not the case. The Democrats are owned lock, stock, and barrel by the bourgeoisie. It's liberal wing, and it just has a facade of being a party of the people. That's not actually what it is. It's helping to legitimize the system. This is not a bunch of equal groups working together in a coalition. And in order to be in the Democratic Party, to have influence, as he's trying to do, you have to play by their rules. Those rules mean moderation, mean compromise. You can't be advocating things like socialist revolution, militancy in the streets. You can't do that. You cannot you challenge the consensus of anti-communism with the Cold War. And I want to emphasize that every time it comes down to it, he's willing to abide by those rules, and he's willing to accept that. And he envisions the Socialist Party as this inside-outside force. But in order to influence the Democratic Party, ultimately the outside force gets sacrificed to stay inside. And the thing is, the proponents of realignment, like Harrington, think it's this weird 33rd dimensional game of chess where they're doing politics serious, changing the Democratic Party, when they're really not. They're really not doing anything. It ultimately comes down to one thing: vote blue no matter who. That's what it is. It's just support the Democrats every 2 to 4 years. And having said that, Harrington, in the 60s, himself he tried to stay in stay with SDS, but it turned, as the Vietnam War is picking up, there's a split in the new left, in the wider left, and SDS is getting involved in the anti-war movement, that they're challenging the Democratic Party and whatnot. And I want to bring this back to something. There's a bit of I remember this debate about 7 years ago. It was either in Jacobin or the Socialist Worker, I forget where it was. And there's this debate over Harrington and the Vietnam War. Well, people are saying he supported it and whatnot. And I feel like this debate was missing the point on Harrington in Vietnam. You read his writings, he's like, I do not support the war. Just like SDS does not support the war. So what does that mean? Well, the point is that the division with Harrington, yes, is not over the war, over supporting the war necessarily, at least not on paper. It's over how you oppose the war. SDS is, again, willing to engage in illegal actions, burning draft cards, militancy. Sections of them are willing to support the Vietnamese NLF in victory against the United States. Harrington himself says, if we want to stop the war, we got to influence the good liberals like Lyndon B. Johnson, who's bombing Vietnam, and everything else. We have to do that. We also have to not do anything militant. We can't embarrass the Democratic Party. And he actually founds an anti-war, or he's a member of an anti-war coalition that basically is trying to corral activists back into the party. Basically, his opposition of the war is to not do anything that would actually, in reality, oppose the war in any real way. And I want to just very quickly about his most famous book, which is called The Other America, which was published in 1962. This is a journalistic expose on poverty. It's written from like this liberal moralistic point of view. And in that sense, it's kind of worth reading. It's in no sense a socialist book. Does not advance that. He didn't want to do that. And you can read it in an afternoon. And it was very influential, more for the review by Dwight MacDonald, who Trotsky said abused being stupid at one point, who reviewed it and got to the attention of JFK and then Lyndon Johnson. And when this influenced the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs, Harrington was very excited about. because his solution of poverty was basically expand the welfare state, have a New Deal that really completes the original New Deal. And he actually is in the White House for about 2 weeks. It's the closest he ever comes to power, and he offers some advice about the Great Society. He doesn't think the Great Society goes far enough, like he really wanted it to look more like Sweden or something. But he still defends it for his whole life, and he really is excited about Lyndon Johnson and all that. That's like matters more to him than everything. And so he's kind of equivocates on Vietnam during the 60s. He breaks with SDS. He's in the orbit of the Democratic Party. And I want to get to his break with Max Shachtman, because Shachtman himself is very gung-ho for the war. He pretty much wants the US to win, and he's embracing a very extreme anti-communism. And also, Shachtman just rejects the entire New Left. He thinks they're all hippies and freaks. Harrington obviously does not like the revolutionaries in the New Left, like in SDS or the Panthers or whomever. He wants to bring out the moderates and unite with them as part of his new majority coalition, along with the labor bureaucracy. And Harrington himself is more looking to progressives in the labor bureaucracy, people like Walter Reuther, whereas Shachtman is really excited about George Meany and basically the very hardcore anti-communists. And this causes factional fighting in the Socialist Party. And I should add, by the late 60s, after Norman Thomas dies, Harrington is actually the chairman of the Socialist Party. And Harrington himself comes out against the Vietnam War very publicly after 1968. And I want to emphasize that this is in no way a principled position, because a Republican is now in the White House, which makes it very easy for someone like that to come out against the Vietnam War. And he's for withdrawal, and Shachtman is, of course, still for victory. And basically, there's this huge factional fighting in the Socialist Party that goes on into the 70s. And, sometimes people make fun of other more revolutionary sections of the left for our splits over really bad issues. And I want to just say, how the Socialist Party of America ended. One faction influenced by Max Shachtman essentially supported Richard Nixon because he was for victory in Vietnam for the United States. And Michael Harrington was very excited about the Democratic candidate in 1972, George McGovern. That's what split the Socialist Party, essentially. Shachtman himself, I think, died around when Nixon got reelected, which is a very sad commentary on his life. Harrington essentially leaves the Socialist Party in 1972, 1973, and another faction had left the Socialist Party earlier, and they actually formed what is now the current Socialist Party United States of America, which still exists. And the Socialist Party renames itself the Social Democrats USA, which essentially becomes this weird kind of anti-communist neocon group. I don't even know if they're still around. Someone can bring that up if they want. Harrington himself formed something called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which is, it's him, it's people like Irving Howe, these New York intellectuals, these labor bureaucrats in like the UAW, New York intellectuals, and they're part of the Socialist International eventually. And it should be noted, when Harrington resigns from the Socialist Party, he's essentially saying, I'm more true to the original vision of realignment and everything. Shachtman abandoned it. So it's more on tactical issues that he leaves with Shachtman as opposed to any principle break. And during the 70s, Harrington is involved in something called the Democratic Agenda, which he thinks is very exciting, a change to the Democratic Party platform to make it, like he says, it's the most progressive thing since like the New Deal or the Great Society. And if you're a liberal, that might be exciting. And it's adopted in the 1976 election and for Carter. And when Carter gets in, Harrington is super excited. He thinks it's this class war at the ballot boxes. He tells Peter Camacho that the corporate class is for Ford, but the working class is for Carter in these weird apologetics. And he thinks that Carter is going to complete the Great Society. What Carter does in office is he basically starts what we call Reaganism, austerity, early attacks on unions and whatnot. And Harrington himself is very upset by this, and he joins an on-paper coalition to oppose Carter, and he actually refuses to support Carter in the 1980 election. He's so distraught. But at the same time, through the 80s, Harrington's group, DSOC, is one of the larger groups on the left speaking, and they're looking to expand, and they find co-thinkers in a group called the New America Movement, which is they were originally close to a Marxist-Leninist position that came out of SDS, but they're moderating very heavily. They're influenced by Euro-communism, and they're getting involved in local Democratic Party politics through the 70s. And they essentially fuse in 1982 because they kind of realized, like, we're pretty much on the same page here. So Harrington's group is kind of more like these old-time intellectuals, bureaucrats, and trade union officials, and the NAM group is more like activist style, and they form what is called the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982, March or so, and Harrington himself is the chairman of DSA. And through the 80s, they're one of the largest groups on the American left. They have about 5,000 to 6,000 members. And they're still doing the same thing. It's realignment. And there's actually, in 1984, there's probably the best chance for a realignment strategy in Harrington's lifetime. This is called the Rainbow Coalition, led by Jesse Jackson, which is a big deal. Jesse Jackson, who I think, he's got all the limitations of a normal Democratic Party politician, all that, but he's actually in many respects more left-wing within those confines than someone, say, Bernie Sanders. So his domestic program is, unites trade unionists, feminists, civil rights groups, and it's for like a very progressive New Deal type thing. And on foreign policy, he's for recognizing Palestine, stopping aid to the Contras in Nicaragua, and everything, which is a lot different than Bernie Sanders, who is a militarist basically. But Harrington himself does not support Jesse Jackson in 1984 because he follows the lead of the labor bureaucracy, who are supporting the exciting candidate of Walter Mondale, who's basically a technocrat, and loses, I think, in 48 or 49 states that year. And in 1988, Jackson runs again with the Rainbow Coalition, but he kind of moderates a bit. He tones down some of his rhetoric. And Harrington actually reaches out to him and is kind of excited. And it should be noted that Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, it has all this, at least on paper, promises of like this huge constituency, but they basically don't do anything, and they just kind of are absorbed into the party apparatus. They don't get anything for supporting Mondale. And the same thing pretty much happens again in 1988 because Jackson loses to Michael Dukakis, and Harrington, who might have been the only person in the world, even more than Michael Dukakis, was excited at the prospects of a Michael Dukakis presidency. He thought that it would open up space for the left and everything, I mean, Michael Dukakis really had all the charisma of Brezhnev right there. So, he wasn't like a Pol Pot figure, what have you. But but anyhow, so this kind of fails, and of course Dukakis loses. But we're getting now towards the end of Harrington's life, because after 1984, he has a form of throat cancer, and it's very aggressive. And it ended up killing him in 1989, in July that year, when he writes his last book, which is dedicated to, I believe, one of the Labor Party leaders of Israel, which is really kind of gross. And he's kind of mourned as this great democratic socialist. Now, I want to bring this up a bit toward the present and go kind of quickly. So when he dies, it's right before the Berlin Wall falls and the Soviet Union collapses. Pretty much the entire left, doesn't matter if you like the Soviet Union or not, you're kind of like negatively affected by that. And DSA was no exception. And DSA officially abandons realignment in the 90s. That doesn't mean they abandon work in the Democratic Party. They are, they're involved with the Clintons. They're involved in 2000. I believe they're actually split 3 ways with the Democrats, the Socialist Party, and I think Ralph Nader. But after that, they kind of support Obama. And this kind of gets us to what is the influence of Harringtonism? Well, this in a number of ways. And the first one is a magazine called Girondin, Jacobin, sorry. If you get the French Revolution references, that's funny. But anyhow, it's a magazine called Jacobin, which is very influential. And their founder, Bhaskar Sankara, is a avowed admirer of Harrington. And they basically kind of popularized democratic socialism, social democracy. And they especially took off in 2016 with the Bernie Sanders first campaign. And that's actually when DSA kind of got a bump because they supported Bernie Sanders in that election. They got a what's 1,000 or 2,000, I don't know how many members. But after Trump got elected, they kind of skyrocketed. So they were roughly like 8,000 members. And to right now, at least on paper, it's something like 94, 95,000. And this is where the influence of Harrington is, on paper, DSA has endorsed like BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. They have left the Socialists International. If you go to different DSA branches, there may be people in reading groups reading Marx or Lenin or whomever. But the thing is, DSA is essentially, it's still on, they're just doing the same thing that Harrington wanted, just with more younger members. Currently, they have about, I don't have the exact number, 100 members who are elected to various offices in Congress, state offices, and what have you, and they're all Democrats. And this includes Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jamal Bowman and everything. And so DSA is still oriented toward the Democratic Party. At their last convention, I believe, in August of last year, they essentially reaffirmed that. And this gets us to Jamal Bowman and the from the DSA leadership to that. The DSA leadership said, we supported Jamal Bowman, even though he doesn't agree with our line on BDS and everything. We also supported Bernie Sanders and Alexandria AOC, who don't support our line on BDS, and that's true actually. So it's not about, so it's like to someone who's saying, we need to discipline Bowman, expel him, and the DSA leadership is saying, well, we supported these other people who did the same thing. You're going to expel them or saying we shouldn't support them? And if you're consistent, if you're going to draw a line, then your answer would be yes. You don't actually want to support them. Because it's not right to say Bowman, who again, he did support Iron Dome. Bernie Sanders has voted for multiple wars in Israel multiple times. Does that get a free pass? AOC has voted for the IDF. Does that get a pass? And this brings up this, I don't like to predict the future too much, but I can say that working within the Democratic Party will not get you to socialism. It will not even get you decent reforms. It will get you to apologize for the imperial party, for the empire. And it doesn't matter how many resolutions you pass about anti-imperialism or BDS. If you're in the Democratic Party, you got to play by those rules. And Harrington was willing to do that. And so far, DSA, aside from minor grumblings, they've been willing to do that. And it's going to run into those issues. And what do we recommend? Well, I think as Marxists, as socialists, as communists, we draw various lines. One of those lines is you do not support the parties of the imperialist bourgeoisie. You do not support Republicans. You do not support Democrats. If you're going to run for office, you do it under your own platform, under your own banner, independently and against them. And even more than that, socialism is not an act of voting harder for a party to get into parliament. It's actually an act of working class self-organization, of self-emancipation. That takes place in the streets, takes place in the places of work, that takes place in wherever oppressed and exploited people are struggling. That's where we belong. We don't belong, within the confines of the Democratic Party. Harrington, that's where his socialism ended up, and it ended up being a socialism devoid of any meaning. It ended up being a Marxism that apologized for labor bureaucrats, that apologized for Israel and the Democratic Party. And it's something that as Marxists, that if we want to have a future beyond capitalism, we need to reject Harrington and his poisonous legacy and embrace what a friend of mine has called MELT, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky, that type of revolutionary communism. That's where you start. The beginning is building your own organizations against these people and rejecting this type of reformism and opportunism. And I know I kind of covered a lot, and I also left out a lot. So what I will say to end on is my book itself comes out in about 3 months. You can pre-order it on Amazon or at Zero Books. And I know stuff that I did not talk about is covered in there, but I'm certain if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer. But again, thank you to the Denver Communists and everyone else who came tonight. I hope my talk was in some way informative to you. So I will take it back to Jason.